What I'd like to do is spend a brief amount of time, just a minute or two, saying something about Caroline Bergvall's Via, and then we're going to do final words. We're going to wrap up. So I'll play a little bit of Via, and then somebody, maybe Max and Dave, maybe you'd both be willing to take a real quick crack at just explaining what this is, how she did it, what it is. And then we'll just see how people react to it. So here's Caroline Bergvall, an amazing performer, doing a kind of weird, beautifully, somewhat spooky performance of this poem years ago.
Sisson, 1981. Halfway along the journey of our life, I woke in wonder in a sunless wood, for I had wandered from the narrow way. Zapula, 1998. Halfway on our life's journey in a wood, from the right path I found myself astray. Parsons, 1893. Halfway through our trek in life, I found myself in this dark wood, miles away from the right road. Ellis, 1995. Halfway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a gloomy wood, by reason that the path direct was lost. Pollock, 1854. Halfway upon the journey of our life, I roused to find myself within a forest, in darkness, for the straight way had been lost. Johnson, 1915.
Max, do you want to just describe in the most basic way what's going on here? How did she put this together?
Sure. So she called all of the translations of the beginning of the Inferno, and here has organized them, or all the translations into English, I should say, has organized them alphabetically by the line, actually. So it's not chronological, it's not alphabetical by name of the translator, but rather by the first word in the
Why
line.
choose that way of ordering?
It's kind of a way of upending, I think, some of our expectations about how an index or an archive works, which usually prioritizes history, chronology, or the authors or the writers, the names that are attached to a text, and instead prioritizing it by the translation, by the text itself.
An index does, oddly, especially with poetry, does do this weird alphabetizing of first lines.
That's
so
true, yes.
It's not archival, it's not bibliographical, and it's not useful, but it's alphabetical, which should put us in mind maybe of Erica Baum's deconstructing the whole question of the categorization of knowledge in the card catalog. Yes, so she puts that together, and she makes a big long list. And how does she read it, Max?
She reads it pretty much with the same tone, in this very calm, kind of lovely, soothing voice. Every line.
The straight way was lost. Carlyle, 1844.
One more.
In the mid-journey of our mortal life, I wandered far into a darksome wood, where the true road no longer might be seen.
So what did you say? An even voice there?
It's almost cataloging. It's almost like she's doing an autopsy of the archive. Like she's pointing to something and then giving you the information. Like, okay, here we have Carlyle, et cetera, et cetera. Like it's really haunting.
Yeah, it's haunting. So I want to get to the haunting quality. Dave Poplar, do you want to add something to that basic info that people need to know about Via? Dave, are you there?
Yeah. Muted, Dave.
Dave, unmute.
Okay, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Yes. No, I think Max covered it.
Oh, after all that, you are too much. Okay, so now let's get some responses to this. All right? Lily, do you want to say something about, do you find it spooky? Haunting, I think is the word.
Yeah, well, so I find the quality of the voice haunting, like Max was saying, but also, if it's this moment where we don't, you assume that the process of translation would more or less produce the same result without like the thinking of a ModPo course behind it, just like thinking about what the word translation means. It means take one thing, do a process to it, and you get out an equivalent thing on the other side. And this exercise obviously shows that that's not the case. But I think her point is more than just to talk about the difficulty of translation. It's also to say, like, this is a text that is seminal, like considered a high form of poetry, and like extremely influential. And yet we may all, depending on when we were born, what language we speak, and what country we live in, have experienced a different version of the text.
Emily, what's a point to be taken from this poem? Let's say a ModPo point, where are we in the history of poetry point.
Yeah, I think it's kind of folding those two ends of history back on themselves. It's kind of one of the kind of earliest, most seminal works of literature and of verse, Dante, right? With something really modern and strange and marginal, and kind of folding them onto each other. And then kind of, weirdly enough, it kind of makes me think of Gertrude Stein. I mean, I guess all of these poems make us think of everything, right? The sense that she's very literally not describing something. She's compiling something, cataloging something, and the poem literally never gets anywhere. You never get out of kind of the middle of this dark wood. And
wait. The poem itself as a form, the words don't get anywhere because she does it over and over again. But the line that she's chosen from Dante is about
being stuck and lost and unable to find your way. About
losing your way. So this is a ModPo-ish thing, because this is this sort of anthemic idea of the course, which is that poetry one can admire, poetry that I personally admire, is a poetry that does what it says, right? So if Dante is, it's kind of like a midlife crisis moment. Halfway through my life, I found myself lost, which is a way of saying, where are we going tonight, Walt Whitman? I don't know what's happening. I don't know where we are. I think our car is spinning around on a French countryside road of what shall we, and then let us bless it. There's a constant way in which our poems, the poems that we've curated here in these 10 weeks, are about not knowing where you're going and never getting anywhere, but in a way that's very productive. When Tracy Morris does exactly what Jason beautifully, eloquently, not sausage, but angels said, or angels that like sausages, what Jason said is that this hesitation, stuttering in the Susan Howe sense meant for Dickinson, of this middle passage, so that it may not end, so that we are always caught, is a positive way of being in the middle of the middle passage. And so too here, we are always about to enter and be lost, always. This is true of the haunting quality of Ron Silliman's life as summarized in Albany, of any one year of Lynn Haginian's life, of the violence that we experience in Amiri Baraka's incident. So much of what we admire in this poetry is in the process of not knowing what to do and not knowing where to go and not providing answers. So the relationship between Tracy Morris's African and Caroline Bergvall's Via is fundamental. And I would love somebody to, because I just said it at great length, but I'd love for somebody to indicate with a little wag of the finger that they're willing to try to restate this and summarize it, because it's so crucial. And I'm looking around, and Anna's going to try. Thank you.
Well, I guess one thing is that poetry doesn't necessarily have to get somewhere or do something. It can just sort of be in itself. And a poem can sort of ask you to sort of like just sit there in it and with it. And that can be enough. And I guess that can leave it, at this point in the course, we're looking at poems that are looking to poetry itself as a source for another poem. We don't necessarily need to look to, I don't know, it's not necessarily asking like a big question or looking at something like feelings. Poetry itself can just be a source for another poem.
Do you feel like taking a swat at this? Poems?
I have
Poems?
something to say about this, but
Okay, I want to. Adelaide, you want to take a swat at this, and then and Carlos can add his thought, but you need a mic. What we're saying here is what we said all semester, which is all 10 weeks, which is how you say what you say is as important as what you say. And also, poems should ideally do what they say, right? So the brain within its groove runs evenly and true, but let a splinter swerve twere easier for you to put a current back, like this poem. You'll never put this poem back. It's going where it's going to go. And fuck the mills.
So I have two things to say. The first is I really appreciate what Bergvall does, just because as I'm going to call it a conservative when it comes to what I like literarily and poetically, I guess. She takes something that I like, Dante, and she makes me look at it a different way. I mean, this is a great line, and she repeats a great line over and over and over again, which in and of itself enacts the great line. And I think that in a very similar way, that's what Morris does. Something that, not in this course, but in the Holocaust course, shameless plug, we've talked about is stuttering as sort of a way of communicating and what that means. And I think that it's really powerful that in the recording that we heard, she essentially is stuttering to sort of say, I need to get something out, but I can't in the way that you want me to.
If I do it smoothly, it will violate, right there is a violation, the violation of the history I'm trying to represent. And misrepresentation or constant mistranslation or variations of translation is the only due respect you can pay to something that is this traumatic and terrifying. Carlos, your thought on this, and then we're going to get final words.
yeah, one of the connections I find so interesting when I think about these two pieces, and I'll start with Via, is sort of this contradictory thing that she's doing where she's both removing the original poem from its pedestal, but then also sort of opening the poem up to be more communal, like saying that, all right, well, the truth, whatever, of this poem actually isn't it, that there are all of these different variations or ways of saying this thing that through translation or through interactions with the reader make up the poem and go into this feeling. And then that same sort of communalness or translation I find present in the work we just listened to, because it's taking this almost like precious little like tied off line, this opening line you might find in whatever, a film or something, and it's complicating it with this almost like what I like to call like the communalness of the self, like that the self in its words contains multitudes, or that's too Whitman-y, but basically that we're all sort of made up of all of these different things, all of these different narratives, and she's almost translating that original line to show that in a way that I think Via is as well.
Yeah, well put. Does anybody know the work by Bergvall called Say Parsley?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's try to piece together what's going on there. I'll start. We have, so Say Parsley is based on the idea of a shibboleth. What's a shibboleth?
It's a word that the pronunciation of which would reveal your ethnicity, place of origin,
Right.
or like the
So
languages
in the biblical Middle East, there are dialects and accents, and if you were really one of us and you came to the gates of the city rather than some marauder or terrorist, we would ask you questions, and there would be a word to say that would give away whether you were truly native to the place inside.
Yeah.
So it was really a language test. So this work, Say Parsley, is based on the massacre of tens of thousands of Creole Haitians on the border of the Dominican Republic in 1937, when the criteria for execution was the failure to pronounce parsley in Spanish in the accepted Spanish manner as opposed to a more Indio or Dominican manner. Now, why would Caroline Bergvall of Via write this thing about a shibboleth? I guess while you're thinking of an answer, I would say that I respect tremendously, that's a bad thing to say since I curated this, but I'm pleased that chapter 9.3 works with, well, Buck is Canadian, Bergvall is French-Norwegian, Rosemary Waldrop is playing on her own German accent, and Tracy Morris is talking about the Middle Passage from Africa. There's a lot of international considerations here, and Say Parsley is worth mentioning in this regard because of the thing about embodied speech. Why would it fit her plan to do a piece like that? Gabe?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Bergvall is really interested in is a multilingualism, in the sense of how things change between languages, how they might be expressed in different languages differently. I think she's interested in transformation through language. Now, that, historically speaking, has not always been a positive thing. If we say, oh, it transforms in other languages, that's not always a good thing, and it can actually be quite bad. And she's really interested in archives and historical work, and most of her work has dealt with this. So one of the things that's going on in Via that we don't really address is that these are translations from Italian. And part of the process of this is the Translation Act, that actually it's so imperfect that you can have this many, and there's way more than just on this page, interpretations of the same 3 lines of Italian terza rima, and that they could have enough of a difference from each other that they could create an effect together when collaged. So she's interested in that. And here it has, I think, more of a neutral, positive tone. But in Say Parsley, she's interested in how that transformation through languages, how immigration and all this has come to a head where it's become a dangerous thing, has become a shibboleth, or has become a marker of, like, deserving death if you can't say something as arbitrary as parsley correctly.
If you project the Trujillo massacre, mass killing, right, genocide, onto what Tracy Morris is trying to say about the Middle Passage, then Tracy, by not pronouncing things in a classical manner, by stuttering, is potentially doomed to the same fate. That is to say, by speaking out, by doing the Dickinsonian stutter, which is what Susan Howe thought, Dickinson risks being so marginal that she can be destroyed. Fortunately, not by the Trujillo of Massachusetts of Dickinson's time, but certainly those who didn't like her attitude toward the Civil War, or those who didn't like her unwillingness to publish, or et cetera, right? So she becomes even more radical when you think about Howe's bringing out the shibboleth in her, all those weird poems that are doing things poems are not supposed to do. And try, it's not just anti-feminism and anti-Semitism that gets Gertrude Stein, everybody saying that, she's a witch or weird, or, we don't want to listen to her. So the people who are willing to risk, it's all a shibboleth. All the experimentation of the way, how doing things with words, it's all a risk that you will suffer the fate of someone who cannot pronounce correctly. Mm-hmm.